Nestling in the heart of the Staffordshire moorlands, Moneystone Quarry is one of the UK's most important reserves of silica sand, a geologically rare mineral used as a raw material in the making of a broad range of everyday items such as glass, ceramics, paints and plastics. Operated by Sibelco UK, Moneystone today supplies a major proportion of the sand used by Britain's container glass industry in the manufacture of millions of bottles and jars each year. In 2008, Moneystone enjoyed a bumper production year with record volumes of sand extracted and processed. Minerals have been extracted on a commercial scale at Moneystone for half a century, during which time many people have earned their livings in a wide range of roles at the quarry.
I came up to Moneystone in 1967, been basically associated with Oakham ever since through doing projects or being based here.
I started 25th of August 1969.
I first came to the plant as a student in 1967, and when I graduated the following year I came back as production assistant.
I started working at Moneystone in 1973, which makes it 36 years.
I started working here in 1960 and I worked here until 1991.
Started work here in November 1973 as a project engineer working for Central Engineering.
I've been here now 14 years this coming November.
Started work at Moneystone from 21st of November 1977.
I joined the company in 2005 as operations manager for this site.
I started here in 1962. I left in June 2007.
I started at Moneystone Quarry when I was 15, November 1972.
I've worked at the quarry for 32 years and I started in 1977.
I worked from 1969 till 1977, returned in 1984 and worked until 1991 as the production manager.
I started on the 7th of June 1959. I believe I was the first person to be employed at Oakham. Well, obviously when I first started there was no quarry. There was just a concrete road down there, which I worked on with another company actually, and that's the reason I was here so early. So there was nothing at all. The main contract hadn't been on site. Without a shadow of a doubt it was welcomed, because you know it was employment for local people, and well, you know, that's what was wanted really.
In the early days, a tremendous amount of the employees were from the local community, from the farming community, several from Cheadle. At that time in the 60s we used to have a bus which called in the works with the workforce. There were very few cars on the car park, probably only about 6 or 8.
The site employed many local people in, you know, I think in the 70s and 80s there was over 100 people working here.
The quarry provided an awful lot of work, both directly and indirectly, for the local people, and also for guest houses and local hotels and pubs and that sort of thing as well.
The people that worked on this site were predominantly local. I mean, there were the local villages. There was very little. Like myself, we came from an agricultural background. My dad was a farmer, and there was a lot of people on this site that came from similar backgrounds to what I did.
In the order of 200 people, it's quite a significant labour force in those days.
And I could certainly name way over 40 people who was resident in Wiston and worked at Oakham. Now, I don't mean all at one time, but over the years. Same applied to Oakham, and I think even at Moneystone, where there's very few houses, over the years there was about 20 people who's worked from there.
At one time you could basically, I was talking to somebody the other day, and you could link probably 30 people from, if you included cousins and intermarriage, from one particular family tree. It was amazing.
You'd have the Copes and the Princes and the Cluses. They're the main ones that come to mind, you know, and a lot of people within the same family working within the same plant. A lot of experience, you know, that was there as well and still is.
Over the past 50 years there's been a number of major changes at Moneystone. These changes have improved production techniques, the competitiveness of the quarry and the working environment.
Well, when I first started here, yes, it was a lot different than it is today. I think first of all that the plant was in the main a dry processing plant as opposed to a wet processing plant. This in the main made the plant, it was rather dusty, it was like hot and very noisy. There was enormous amount of engineering maintenance work to be done. This is due mainly to the abrasiveness of the material.
And the aerofoil mill was a dry mill. and we couldn't get more than 50 tonnes an hour out of it. The leaching plant was being designed to do 60 tonnes an hour. So obviously we were going to have a leaching plant that could run at 60 and a dry aerophore which could only manage 50. So in around about 68, 69, the whole of the pre-leaching process was altered and the mill was turned to wet milling and with a filter put in so that we could give sort of 5% moisture sand to the leaching plant, and eventually that got us up to about 80 to 90 tonne an hour.
The aerophore, when it went from dry to wet, was a vast improvement. It was a very, very dirty job when it was dry. There was a lot of dust about, but then when, same as the elevators and the filters, they were subject to humidity and it used to get very, very wet. So it was an absolute filthy job, you know, doing any maintenance on them. And it was a vast improvement when it went on to wet.
It was in very good condition when I got here because Bert Smith and Ray Salt had been managers then, and they'd got it up and running from the early 60s, and it was pretty profitable. But as the company knew, it would have to basically put in a new plant within 8 years of starting up in order to keep the glass industry supplied. And that meant trying to develop a process which, in hindsight, was the leaching plant.
The leaching plant was installed just before I was employed, probably around about 1970. What would happen prior to that, we had a process going on which was attrition and flotation, where we could remove some of the impurities out of the rock.
There were some cases where some of the rock we couldn't treat. But of course when the leaching plant went in, they could more or less put anything through and get it to the required standard, of course.
In itself, hot acid leaching was extremely successful. The problem was with the leaching plant in the first instance that the acid recovery plant associated with that was a disaster, and we went through a very, very difficult period. It's probably the most difficult period production-wise in my time here.
There were huge amount of teething problems, and the previous leaching plant superintendent left, and I actually came up here at about 2 days' notice. But it was a 7-day-a-week, 24-hour-a-day job really for quite a number of months.
Because all the research work had shown that hydrochloric acid would have to be used as the main thing in the leaching plant, we had 3 years of absolute hell trying to get the leaching plant going because it was an acid regeneration plant, and only in sort of 1973 did we try then to switch over to sulfuric acid.
Which was a bit less effective chemically, and we weren't able to try and recover the acid in the same way as we had with the hydrochloric. But in terms of plant operation and making it a better environment, it was the answer.
And when that switch was made, then suddenly a lot of the problems went away. The works then became profitable, and by the 80s, the works was really going strong.
Well, in the leaching plant had what we call a preheater prior to it, and this increased the temperature of the sand so that the reaction would take place. And occasionally we used to have the odd problem. We had to shut the leaching plant down pretty quick, and as a consequence, sand used to run into what they called the heater chamber, which was located underneath the preheater. And so one of the tasks was to actually dig it out. And on one particular occasion we shut down pretty quickly, and Chris Jewson, then the quarry manager, decided that he and I would dig it out. So we took the inspection plate off, and inside was a lining of refractory brick. We took that out, and then we started to dig the sand. And unfortunately I got a large spade of sand and it hit one of the refractory bricks as I was chucking it away. And it went all over Chris Jewson's face, down the side to be precise, to which he was not very happy, and he started to curse me and blaspheme. And then a few seconds on, a voice came over the radio saying, Mr. Jewson, BIS1, your radio's stuck and you're now transmitting throughout the quarry. So everybody enjoyed Mr. Jewson's
Outburst.
Yeah, well, and everybody enjoyed Chris's outburst.
All the rock was extracted from, first of all, they were drilled down. You know, there was drilling taking place on a regular basis. There would be drilling and blasting in the early days, probably 2 or 3 times a week.
They drilled holes, I think about 20 or 30 feet deep, something like that, a series of holes, charged them, and then everybody got out of the way and it went bang.
It was common in those days for wait for the siren to go off. You wait for the rocks possibly to go up in the air and then make a run for it if you were under the nearest building, and that's not exaggerating. Our workshop at that time had a corrugated tin roof, and to stand underneath the corrugated roof and hear the rocks pelting down on top of it was quite common.
I was glad to see the end of blasting, of course, and ripping took over. Well, of course, it's a big machine with it's like a spike on the back, you know, and it is a big machine, like, you know. And of course, he just jacks it into the rock, moves forward and rips it, literally. Then, of course, he'll turn around and push it with his blade, like. And travelling over up and down, he breaks it up.
The sand that has been produced at the quarry has been sent out across the UK and the world to many different companies, and since 1959 the quarry has gone by a number of different names.
As I was employed, it was called BIS, British Industrial Sand.
Everybody calls it Oakham because in the BIS days they always named the quarry after the nearest sort of village. It's called Moneystone Quarry because of the local hamlet.
Obviously BIS, and then it was HMC.
Start off with BIS, which was the name when I was employed.
Epworth Minerals and Chemicals, Sibelco Minerals and Chemicals.
We then progressed to Genifax. Then we went on to Epworth Mineral and Chemicals.
And more recently we've changed back to Sibelco UK to reflect what the major company, the international company's called. As regards the bulk of the sand, that's gone off to glassworks.
Pilkingtons, CWS.
The secondary products have gone into making aerated concrete blocks.
A lot of the large container type glass industries.
Probably United Glass was the one that was supplied most regularly when I first came here.
The ceramics, the local potteries.
The glass sand is going into a big facility in Ellesmere Port. Some of the co-products that we make goes to the local cement factory, and the cristobalite goes into other more specialist applications. So it's quite diverse. We supply very locally, and some of our specialist materials have gone as far as the Far East, Middle East.
The rail link is now quiet and overgrown, but not so long ago the majority of the sand was sent out by train.
We used to send out the bulk of our glass sand by rail, usually a couple of train loads a day, which was just over 500 tonnes per train load, 5 days a week, sometimes Saturday morning as well.
I think certainly in the early days it really was going really all over the place, really, because at that time we could send it out by rail as well as it being road. They were in the early days, they worked parallel. There was a very active rail siding, and that ran until 1980s, something like that.
Certainly towards the late 70s and early 80s, a lot of sand went out by rail, perhaps up to 2 trains per day, which carried up to 1,000 tonnes, then obviously by road as well.
The last train went out August Bank Holiday week in 1988. We'd reduced the number of customers who've got a railhead down to one in St Helens, and they're only having 1,500 tonnes a week, so it was neither economic. British Rail didn't want to get involved with it, so eventually, to save cost, the operation went by road.
The sidings were, and still are, a beautiful place and a beautiful little valley, so it was a very tranquil place to be. I do remember in the very early days, even the steam engines coming down and chucking coal off to My uncle, who was at very early days, was in the Welby bridge and standing, and he would be sitting alongside his stove, and they would throw coal off the train so that he could use it to brew his tea and keep the stove going in the Welby bridge in those early days. And they were a very, very pleasant area to be.
The railway sidings were also once used for a far more unusual purpose by some very special guests.
I was directly involved with the SAS. We got involved with providing facilities for them to bunker up down at the clay body plant. Then I took the SAS down to the railway sidings, and they sort of decided how they're going to tackle the exercise. And what they ultimately did, they brought in a carriage, or two carriages actually, and then they had Chinook helicopters, and they did the old dropping down the rope and using the guns and all sorts. It was pretty distinctive actually.
I was sort of fairly alarmed on the occasion that the SAS did come in. Living in the village of Oakham Moor, the first note that we had of that was huge explosions.
It was living close to. I mean, what I remember most about it is he was preparing to go at night. They'd got the two helicopters, and one was the old Chinook, which if you've heard them very low down, you can imagine the noise. And he went, 2 or 3 times in circuits around, and it was a real old clatter that was.
They were practising hostage situations using rail carriages. And on the Saturday night, the first Saturday night they actually did the exercise, 2 of the locals decided that they ought to go up and have a look at see what was happening because of the noise.
I did have a cousin who lived nearby and went to investigate. He was quite a lot braver than I, and he finished up being having his hands tied behind his back and lying on the ground for a couple of hours until he was rescued by another team, so he obviously got a little bit too close.
We used to have a commercial manager who had a little allotment up by the garages, and he always used to, why the hell can I not grow potatoes in this plot? It was funny, and it turned out that the guys on B shift, when they were on nights, used to tunnel under his potato furrows, pinch the blinking potatoes and chip them up in the evening. Absolutely great. I never found out about this until just recently. It's marvellous.
Over the years, the various sports and social clubs have played an important role in the lives of the workers.
Well, when I first started, we used to have the annual event, annual day out, as it were. I remember we used to have trips out to London and things like that.
The social club was going well when I arrived. I mean, they had a football team. It was really, really strong.
There were certainly football matches played against 1 or 2 of the other quarries like Red Hill and King's Lynn, and cricket matches as well.
We went to some of the other quarries and played them at cricket and wiped the floor with them.
We had cricket teams, we had football teams, and we used to have an inter-work darts knockout.
I think Chris Jewson set up like an inter-darts competition once a year, like a departmental thing. It was like a social thing at night time, and have a laugh and have a drink.
We had an internal darts tournament, which really got people together because management and the workforce all got together. We had about 16 teams, I think, from all the different departments like electricians, fitters. Each shift, ABC shift had a team, management had a couple of teams.
I've never been much of a dart player, but I've got two prizes at home. One is a set of wine glasses and the other is a carriage clock. Generally speaking, I was the reserve and not an active participant in the team.
That was always good fun. We met at different pubs, and it was always very competitive.
We didn't win a lot of matches, but we could always hold our own at the bar kind of things.
And they were great nights, and everybody could let their hair down and get to know each other, and it made a lot of difference to morale, and people appreciated it.
I used to play football up in the field, up in the top end. And when Bird Slade used to come out to us and during winter and say, like, you play football in snow, we weren't bloody working it.
It probably grew out of the 20-minute football game that we had at lunchtime, really. It was all kick and rush and sweat, and playing in quarry boots, it was extremely entertaining. We should spend 20 minutes at all going at each other like nothing on earth, and then probably the rest of the afternoon arguing about who won and who lost.
Freddie Steele, who was the manager then of Port Vale, it said in the Sentinel that any local teams that wanted use their facilities, that were open to them. So we took him at his word, and I rang him up and said, can we come up and do some training up there? And he said yes, and he actually met us up there, and Lol Hamnet, who was the chief coach at that time for Port Vale, he actually coached us. So, and I think we were the only team who took him up on it, and we went for quite a few weeks, well, quite a few months. I think it was either 6 or 8 times we went there, and those were the only matches we won.
In the year of 1963, I remember walking down, I used to walk to work in those days. I was walking down the river, down towards the river bank. It was very cold, almost dark one night. One of the ladies who worked in the canteen, Peggy Tipper her name was, Peggy was probably smaller than me, but almost as far round as she was tall. Lovely lady, they're one of the happiest little people you could ever wish to meet in your life. She was walking just ahead of me on this particular night as we walked down to the rail. It was in the winter of 1963, I believe. She slipped. She fell on her bottom. She was chubby. She started to slide down this hill. Now, those are people that will know the railway hill. They'll know how long and how straight and how smooth it is. I was just hysterical. I tried to help her, but she was spinning faster and faster. Her legs were up in the air, her arms were up in the air. She was spinning all the way down the bottom on the bum. I couldn't catch her, I couldn't get anywhere near her. She was gaining speed all the way down. All I could hear was these reeks of laughter and shouting. And when I got to the bottom, the only thing that she was concerned about is whether she'd broken the glass Pyrex bowl with her husband's supper that she was taking home when she got home.
The quarry is close to several villages, Oakermore, Whiston and Moneystone. Over the years, the company has sought to promote good community links in a number of different ways.